There are men who collect ships. There are men who collect power. And then there was Aristotle Onassis, who collected both, and somewhere along the way collected the most famous women in the world to go with them. His name has never quite faded. You still see it attached to art foundations, to an island in the Ionian Sea, to a chapter of American history that most people thought they understood. But the actual story of how he moved through the world, through two marriages, one of the most devastating love affairs of the 20th century, and a series of events that reads less like a biography and more like a Greek tragedy in the classical sense, is stranger and darker and more human than the tabloid version ever managed to capture. This is that story. Segment 8. The Boy from Smyrna. To understand Aristotle Onassis, you have to start where he started, a port city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, a place that in the early 20th century was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the Mediterranean. He was born on January 20th, 1906, in Smyrna, a city then part of the Ottoman Empire, home to a large and prosperous Greek community that had lived there for centuries. His father, Socrates Onassis, was a successful tobacco merchant. The family was comfortable, educated, positioned at the center of a world that felt permanent. Young Aristotle graduated from the local evangelical Greek school at 16, speaking 4 languages: Greek, Turkish, English, and Spanish. He had a rebellious streak that got him suspended from school more than once. His father worried about him constantly. It wasn't. In September 1922, the Greco-Turkish War ended in catastrophe for the Greeks of Smyrna. The city was set on fire. The Greek and Armenian quarters burned for days. Hundreds of thousands of people fled to the waterfront, desperate to board any ship that would take them away. The Onassis family lost nearly everything: their home, their business, their sense of the ground beneath their feet. Aristotle, 16 years old, watched his city burning from a ship in the harbour. Several of his relatives, including uncles, an aunt, and a cousin, died in the fire, burned to death in a church where hundreds of Christians had taken shelter. His father was imprisoned by Turkish authorities. The rest of the family made it to Greece, but Greece was already overwhelmed with refugees and offered little in the way of opportunity. Aristotle made a decision. In August 1923, armed with a Nansen passport, a document issued to stateless refugees, and roughly $250 in his pocket, he sailed to Buenos Aires. He arrived in Argentina not knowing a soul. He took a job as a night shift telephone operator for the British United River Plate Telephone Company and spent his days trying to revive some version of the family tobacco business. He was 17 years old. By the time he was 21, he was a millionaire. The story of how he got there is pure Onassis. Working the telephone switchboard at night, he listened to business calls that weren't his to hear and used what he learned to position himself in deals before anyone else knew the deals were happening. He spotted an opening in the Argentine cigarette market, built his own import business around Turkish tobacco, created a brand aimed specifically at women, at a time when most cigarettes were marketed exclusively to men, and through sheer relentlessness turned his commission income into real capital. By the end of 2 years of trading, he had earned over $100,000 in commissions alone. Then, at the height of the Great Depression, precisely the moment when every rational person was getting out of the shipping business, he bought his first 6 cargo ships at a fraction of their actual value. He had his first oil tanker built in 1938. By the time the Second World War ended, he had maneuvered himself into position to buy 23 surplus American Liberty ships, built a fleet of supertankers, and become one of the most powerful private ship owners in the world. By the 1950s, He owned the Monte Carlo casino through a controlling interest in the Société des Bains de Mer. In 1957, he founded Olympic Airways and turned the struggling Greek national airline into a private operation. He built a fleet that eventually exceeded 70 vessels sailing under flags of convenience, mostly Panamanian and Liberian, which kept his costs low and his profits high. He commissioned 17 supertankers in 1954 alone. His fleet was larger than the navy of many countries. None of this happened quietly. Onassis was not a man who wanted to be anonymous. He wanted to be known, admired, envied. He wore his wealth openly. He dated famous women. He threw parties. He drank and argued and charmed and intimidated. He was, by virtually every account, magnetic in person. Short, stocky, with dark eyes that almost everyone who met him described as unusually penetrating. And he used that magnetism, the way he used everything else, as a tool. What he was about to find, though, was that the next chapter of his life would bring him into contact with a woman who could not be managed, used, or ultimately held. Segment 7. Tina, Niarchos, and the world's most glamorous rivalry. In 1946, Aristotle Onassis married Athena Livanos. She was 17 years old. He was 40. Her father, Stavros Livanos, was the most powerful Greek shipping magnate of the era, and the fact that Onassis had won his daughter was a statement in itself. It was not an easy courtship. Stavros Livanos had been approached first by Stavros Niarchos, Onassis's great rival, who had asked for Tina's hand when she was just 14. The father told him to be patient. There was an older daughter, Eugenia, who had to marry first. Onassis came second in line with the same request and received the same answer. He waited. He sent gifts, took Tina sailing, invited the family aboard his yacht, and pursued the match with the same dogged patience he brought to his most important business negotiations. Finally, in 1946, Stavros Livanos gave his blessing. The wedding in New York that December was the social event of the season for the Greek shipping world. Tina, as she was known to everyone, was born in London on March 19, 1929. She had grown up in both London and New York, educated in the finest schools, moving through a world of princes and socialites and international money. She was beautiful and socially polished in ways that Onassis, for all his wealth, was not. According to his biographer, Peter Evans, Onassis could walk into any room in the most expensive suit available and still look like a man trying to impress. Tina walked into the same rooms and simply belonged there. They had 2 children, both born in New York City, a son, Alexander, in 1948, and a daughter, Christina, in 1950. Onassis named his legendary superyacht the Christina O after his daughter. But the marriage also brought into sharp relief the relationship that would define Onassis's public reputation for the rest of his life: his rivalry with Stavros Niarchos. Niarchos was another Greek shipping tycoon, perhaps the only man in the world who operated at the same level of wealth and power as Onassis, and the only man who could genuinely be said to have made Onassis feel competitive. The 2 men knew each other, circled each other, watched each other's deals and relationships with the intensity of rivals who have no one else to measure themselves against. And within a year of Onassis marrying Tina, Niarchos did something that transformed the rivalry into something far more personal. He married Eugenia Livanos, Tina's older sister. The 2 shipping titans were now brothers-in-law. They shared family dinners. Their children grew up together, and they despised each other with a focused, sustained energy that never quite softened into anything warmer. Niarchos and Onassis competed over everything: the size of their tankers, the grandeur of their yachts, their access to the most powerful people in the world. The rivalry was never entirely about business. It was about identity. Onassis wanted to be recognized as the greatest Greek shipowner alive. So did Niarchos. There was only room for one. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, as Onassis was building his empire and living the life of an international magnate, his marriage to Tina was quietly falling apart. They were living separate lives by the mid-1950s. The beginning of the end came, according to Onassis's biographer, when Tina discovered her husband in a compromising situation with a friend of hers at their house in Cap d'Antibes. There was no recovery from that. Onassis had affairs. Tina had her own life. The marriage was, by most accounts, sustained more by convention and appearances than by any genuine closeness. After Tina finally filed for divorce in 1959, she married John Spencer Churchill, later the 11th Duke of Marlborough, in October 1961. That marriage lasted nearly a decade, and then, in October 1971, she married Stavros Niarchos himself, Onassis's lifelong rival, and the widower of her own older sister Eugenia, who had died the year before under circumstances that generated enormous controversy and were officially ruled as an accidental drug overdose. The thought of Tina marrying Niarchos, the man Onassis had competed against for his entire career, the man who had married her sister, was the kind of thing that in any other context would seem too strange to be real. In the world of Greek shipping dynasties, it simply seemed inevitable. Then, in 1957, Onassis went to Venice, and everything changed. Segment 6. The most famous Greeks alive. The party was hosted by Elsa Maxwell, an American gossip columnist and celebrated socialite who had spent decades curating the overlap between money, celebrity, and glamour. In the summer of 1957, she threw a gathering in Venice in honor of Maria Callas, the Greek-American opera soprano who was, at that moment, the most celebrated singer in the world. Callas was born in New York City in December 1923 to Greek immigrant parents. She had become famous in a way that went beyond the opera world. She had a voice that people described as capable of expressing things that words couldn't reach, and a personal charisma that made her as much a figure of popular culture as she was a musician. She was also, by 1957, married to Giovanni Battista Meneghini, an Italian industrialist, and her manager, 27 years her senior, who had supported her career and given her stability in her early years. She had grown beyond what that stability could contain. Onassis walked into Maxwell's party in Venice and met Callas. He later told the Greek film producer Spiros Skouras that there had been a natural curiosity between them, that they were, after all, the two most famous Greeks alive in the world. The curiosity did not immediately become anything else. In 1957, they were both still married to other people, and the encounter at the Venice party was something both of them publicly dismissed as merely a pleasant social meeting. 2 years later, in 1959, Onassis invited Callas and her husband Meneghini aboard the Christina for a Mediterranean cruise. It was the kind of invitation that couldn't really be declined. Onassis's yacht was the most famous private vessel in the world, a floating palace with a swimming pool whose floor could be raised to become a dance floor, bar stools upholstered in the skin of a sperm whale's teeth, and a regular guest list that included Winston Churchill, Grace Kelly, and the most powerful figures in post-war European society. Also on board that cruise was Tina, still Onassis's wife. By the time the Christina dropped anchor at the end of the journey, Tina had watched her husband fall for Callas in front of her, and she had no interest in pretending otherwise. She disembarked early. Within weeks, Onassis and Callas were openly together in Milan. On September 9th, 1959, Callas confirmed that her marriage to Meneghini was over. Tina filed for divorce in New York soon after, citing adultery. By the end of that cruise, 2 marriages were over. The affair between Onassis and Callas became one of the defining public romances of the era. Both of them were, in their respective worlds, forces of nature. And their relationship had the quality of 2 forces of nature occupying the same space. He was drawn to her celebrity, her Greekness, her independence. She was drawn to his power, his warmth, his ability to make her feel seen in ways that her carefully controlled public life had never allowed. They were photographed together everywhere. They travelled on the Christina. They attended galas and dinners and opera performances across Europe. Callas had given up much of her performing career by this point. Whether by choice, by the natural decline of a voice that had always operated at its absolute limit, or by some combination of both. She wanted, eventually, to settle down, to have children, to have a life beyond the stage. Onassis divorced Tina formally in 1960. Callas separated from Meneghini. And then, for years, Onassis simply did not marry her. There were pregnancies during the 1960s that did not result in children. According to biographer Nicholas Gage, Callas bore Onassis a son in 1960 who died hours after birth. There were also reported miscarriages, and an account, never publicly confirmed, of a pregnancy in 1966 that ended at Onassis's urging. She wanted permanence. He gave her presence, proximity, passion, and a kind of love that his private secretary Kiki Ferudi Moutsatsos later described as the most genuine he was ever capable of. And he gave her everything except the one thing she actually asked for. Meanwhile, the world that surrounded them was shifting. The Kennedy presidency had ended in Dallas on November 22, 1963, and the most famous woman in the world was suddenly a widow. Segment 5. The first encounter with Jackie. Aristotle Onassis had encountered Jacqueline Kennedy long before the assassination. In the fall of 1963, Jackie was struggling with a profound depression following the death of her infant son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, who had been born prematurely in August of that year and died 2 days later. Her sister, Lee Radziwill, who had her own connection to Onassis that the tabloids had been speculating about for some time, with some accounts suggesting she had been romantically involved with him before Jackie came into the picture, invited Jackie to recover aboard the Christina on a Mediterranean cruise. President Kennedy had reservations about the trip. His administration was not enthusiastic about his wife sailing on the private yacht of a man who had been indicted by the United States government for fraud in the early 1960s over a complicated arrangement involving the purchase of surplus American ships, a deal that had made Onassis wealthy, but that American prosecutors argued had violated the terms under which the ships were sold to foreign buyers. The State Department was also uneasy, but Jackie needed to be somewhere else for a while, and Kennedy relented. Jackie sailed with Onassis in October 1963. She had a wonderful time. The world that existed on the Christina, the Mediterranean light, the freedom from the relentless scrutiny of Washington, the company of a man who was warm and attentive and asked nothing of her in return, was the opposite of everything her life as First Lady had been. She returned to Washington on October 17, 1963. 5 weeks later, she was standing beside her husband in a motorcade in Dallas. After the assassination, Onassis was one of the first to reach out. He attended the state funeral. He sent flowers, then letters, then visited in person. In the years that followed, he visited Jackie and the children in Hyannisport, called her regularly, and maintained the kind of steady, attentive presence that the Kennedy family, wrapped in its own grief and its own complicated dynamics, could not always provide. He was a thread of continuity in a world that had been violently disrupted. He asked nothing of her. He simply showed up. And then, in June 1968, Robert Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles. The second Kennedy assassination in 5 years sent Jackie into a state of fear that people who knew her described as genuine, visceral, and almost beyond consolation. She had spent years managing the anxiety of being a public figure in a country that had already killed her husband. Bobby's death confirmed what she had been trying not to believe. She turned to Onassis. The decision, when she made it, was not primarily romantic. Jackie herself, in the statement she released after Onassis's death in 1975, described him as the man who had rescued her at a moment when her life was engulfed in shadows. Onassis had a private island with its own security force of 75 armed men. He owned an airline. He had resources that could protect her children in ways that the United States government, which would revoke her Secret Service protection upon her remarriage, could not. He also, according to nearly everyone who knew them both, genuinely cared about her. His personal secretary Moutsatsos said that Onassis adored Jackie's children, that he was warm and attentive in ways that surprised people who knew his reputation for hardness in business. His love for her may have been layered, part genuine affection, part the satisfaction of possessing the most famous woman in the world, part the fulfillment of a decades-long ambition to stand at the absolute center of the world's attention. But it was not entirely cynical. Maria Callas heard about the engagement 3 weeks before the ceremony. She had no warning beyond that. She later spoke about it in terms that were controlled and cold and heartbroken in equal measure. On October 20th, 1968, in a small chapel on the island of Skorpios, Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy before 40 guests. She wore a knee-length ivory lace dress designed by Valentino. He wore a dark suit. Her children, Caroline and John Jr., held tall ceremonial candles in the Greek Orthodox tradition. His children, Alexander and Christina, both deeply unhappy about the marriage and still hoping, quietly, that their father might one day reconcile with their mother, watched from a corner of the chapel. Alexander reportedly said of the match that his father loved names and Jackie loved money. It was not entirely fair to either of them, but it captured something real. Before the ceremony, a financial arrangement had been negotiated through Ted Kennedy, Jackie's former brother-in-law. Jackie would receive $3 million immediately, plus $1 million for each of her 2 children. Compensation for the Kennedy family trust income she would forfeit by remarrying. Upon Onassis's death, she would receive an additional $150,000 annually from his estate. The prenuptial negotiation was reported in detail by the press and did nothing to improve the public reception of the wedding. The headlines were merciless. One American newspaper ran the question, "Jackie, how could you?" across its front page. Across Europe, where Onassis's business practices and personal life were better known, the reaction was, if anything, more hostile. She was condemned as a woman who had sold her dignity. He was dismissed as a vulgarian who had bought what he wanted. Neither of them, by most accounts, particularly cared. Segment 4. Life on Skorpios and the Callas problem. The marriage was unusual from the beginning. Jackie continued to live primarily in New York, where her children were in school. Onassis kept his apartment on Avenue Foch in Paris and continued his business operations across the world. They came together on Skorpios, on the Christina, at events where appearing together served some purpose. They spent real time with each other. Family photographs from the Skorpios' years show them looking genuinely at ease in each other's company, swimming, eating, sitting on the terrace of the Pink House, the villa on the island that Jackie was permitted to redecorate according to her own taste. The Christina was Onassis's domain, and he did not want its decor touched. Scorpios, at least in that one corner, was hers. Jackie's spending was a source of tension that never fully resolved. Onassis had given her a monthly allowance of $30,000. She routinely exceeded it, spending, by some accounts, over $1 million on clothing alone in the first year of their marriage. Onassis was not a man who liked to be surprised by invoices, but he was also a man who had pursued Jackie Kennedy for years and was not about to let money become the reason she left. The more fundamental problem was Maria Callas. Within weeks of the wedding, Onassis was visiting Callas in Paris. His personal secretary, who was in a position to know, later said that he was seeing Callas 3 or 4 times a week in the period immediately following the ceremony. Jackie was aware of what was happening. She turned, at one point, to Onassis's sister Artemis, who was one of the few people who moved comfortably between all the relevant parties. She handled the situation the same way she had handled everything difficult in her public life, with perfect composure on the outside, and whatever she actually felt kept entirely to herself. Jackie had grown up in a world where powerful men had affairs, and she had been through enough to know that fighting it would cost her more than ignoring it. Onassis, for his part, seems to have genuinely loved both women in different ways. Callas was, by the testimony of virtually everyone close to him, the love of his life in the deepest sense, the person who understood him, who matched his emotional register, who shared his Greek identity and his sense of himself as someone who had come from nothing and made himself into something extraordinary. Jackie was the achievement, the confirmation that he had arrived at the very top of the world's most rarefied social atmosphere. He did not experience these two things as contradictions. Callas, who had already given up the greatest years of her career, in part because of her relationship with him, found herself in the most painful possible position. The woman he apparently loved most, living alone in a Paris apartment while he was married to someone else. She was too proud to show it publicly. In a 1974 interview, asked about Jacqueline Onassis, she said with careful flatness that she did not know the woman and had never met her. The two of them never did meet, though Jackie had once attended a performance of Callas singing at the Metropolitan Opera in New York in 1965. Callas's comeback performance at the Met, which also happened to be Jackie's first major public appearance following the assassination. She died in that Paris apartment on September 16, 1977, of a heart attack at the age of 53. Onassis had been dead for over 2 years by then. Whether she recovered from losing him is something that people who knew her debated for decades and never resolved. But before all of that, before Callas's death, before Onassis's death, before the story reached any kind of conclusion, something happened in January 1973 that broke Aristotle Onassis in a way that nothing else had ever managed to do. Segment 3, Alexander and the Breaking of Aristotle Onassis. On January 22, 1973, Alexander Onassis, Aristotle's 24-year-old son, was at Hellinikon International Airport in Athens, supervising a training exercise for a potential new pilot of his personal amphibious aircraft. A few seconds after takeoff, the plane's right wing dropped. The aircraft crashed almost immediately, in a flight that lasted no more than 15 seconds. Alexander survived the crash itself. He was taken to a hospital in Athens. His father, in New York when he received the news, collapsed from shock and then flew immediately to Greece. His ex-wife, Tina, arrived from Switzerland with her husband, Stavros Niarchos, the man who had married her after their divorce, and who had already been through his own family tragedy when his first wife, Eugenia Livanos, Tina's older sister, had died in 1970. The accumulation of grief and intrigue surrounding these families had by this point taken on a weight that felt almost impossible to process in ordinary terms. Onassis flew a neurosurgeon from London to Athens. The surgeon examined Alexander and told his father that there was no chance of survival. Alexander had suffered catastrophic brain injuries. He died on January 23, 1973, without regaining consciousness. The investigation into the crash eventually concluded that it had been caused by the reversal of aileron control cables during the installation of a new control column. A mechanical error, in other words, not a conspiracy. But Onassis refused to believe it was an accident. He offered a reward of $1 million for proof that his son's death had been deliberately arranged, and he suspected, for the rest of his life, that the CIA had been involved, a suspicion rooted in his complicated history with the American government and the Greek military junta. No evidence ever emerged to support that theory. What Alexander's death did to Onassis was visible to everyone around him. He had, for 40 years, built an empire partly because he intended to leave it to his son. That purpose was gone. The energy that had driven him through every business deal, every rivalry, every comeback from failure, seemed to drain away in the months after January 1973. He spent the remaining months of 1973 in a state of grief that those close to him found alarming, not the vocal, demonstrative grief of a man who would eventually recover, but something quieter and more final. He sold Olympic Airways back to the Greek government at the end of 1974. He stopped making the kinds of bold moves that had defined his entire career. The man who had bought 6 cargo ships at the bottom of the Great Depression because everyone else was selling simply ran out of reasons to keep acquiring things. His health deteriorated rapidly. He developed myasthenia gravis, a condition that weakened the muscles around his eyes and face, giving him an appearance that people who knew him found almost unbearable to look at. He began taping his eyelids open with surgical tape to keep them from drooping shut. He continued to travel and to work, but the momentum was gone. His marriage to Jackie had already been cooling for some time. By 1974, Onassis was reportedly considering divorce. His relationship with Jackie had never found its footing in the way either of them had perhaps hoped, and the loss of Alexander had left him with very little capacity for the kind of performance that keeping the marriage alive seemed to require. Some reports indicated that by the end, he had instructed lawyers to begin preparing divorce papers. Jackie, by then, was spending most of her time in New York, working on her own life, building a degree of independence that had been difficult to achieve inside the marriage. The summer and fall of 1974 brought more grief. Eugenia Livanos, Tina's older sister, the woman who had been Niarchos's first wife and whose death in 1970 had been surrounded by controversy, had already been gone for 4 years. And then Tina herself died. Tina Livanos, Onassis's first wife, the mother of his children, the woman who had married his arch-rival Niarchos, died on October 10th, 1974, in a hotel suite in Paris. She was 45 years old. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary edema, believed to be connected to her use of barbiturates. Her daughter Christina, who had already lost her brother less than 2 years earlier, now lost her mother as well. The accumulation of loss in the Onassis and Livanos families in those years was staggering. Son, mother, first wife, all within a span of less than 2 years. Segment 2. The End and What Remained. On March 15th, 1975, Aristotle Onassis died at the American Hospital of Paris in Neuilly-sur-Seine. He was 69 years old. The official cause was respiratory failure, complicated by the pneumonia and myasthenia gravis that had been consuming his strength for months. Jackie was with him in the final weeks. He was buried on Scorpios beside his son Alexander, under the cypresses near the small chapel where he had married Jackie 7 years earlier. Jackie received her settlement from the estate, reportedly around $26 million, negotiated by Ted Kennedy on her behalf. Christina Onassis, who had never warmed to her stepmother and had spent years managing a contemptuous distance, eventually agreed to the settlement in exchange for Jackie not contesting the will. Christina took control of the Onassis shipping empire and ran it with considerable skill, though her personal life was marked by the same kind of turbulence that had surrounded her family for decades. She married 4 times, battled weight and health problems that were documented mercilessly by the press, and died in Argentina on November 19th, 1988, at the age of 37, of cardiac arrest. She was buried on Scorpios, beside her father and brother. Her daughter, Athena, born in 1985 from her final marriage to French businessman Thierry Roussel, was 3 years old when Christina died and inherited everything. One of the largest private fortunes in the world, and the weight of a family name that had outlasted most of the people who carried it. Jackie returned to New York. She was 45 years old. She began working as a book editor, first at Viking Press and then at Doubleday, for a salary that was almost comically modest by the standards of the life she had been living. She did the work seriously and with genuine dedication, and by many accounts found in it something she had been looking for her whole life, a way to be interesting and useful without being stared at. Over the next 19 years, she acquired nearly 100 works of fiction and non-fiction. She was known, in the publishing world, as someone who took the work seriously and treated writers with genuine respect. She lived with a companion named Maurice Templesman, a diamond merchant and financier, from around 1980 until her death in 1994 from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She never remarried. She died in her apartment on Fifth Avenue, was buried at Arlington National Cemetery beside President Kennedy, and left behind one of the most complicated and still hotly debated legacies in American cultural history. The world she and Onassis had occupied together, the yacht and the island and the parties and the headlines, had dissolved almost entirely within a decade of his death. Scorpios was eventually sold by Christina's daughter, Athena Onassis Roussel, decades later. The Christina O changed ownership several times over the years. The empire Aristotle had spent his life building was restructured, sold off in parts, and eventually subsumed into the ordinary churn of global finance. What remained was the Onassis Foundation, established in memory of Alexander, which continues to fund scholarships, cultural programs, and public works in Greece and internationally. And the name, still attached to the story of a man who began his life as a teenage refugee watching his city burn, arrived in a foreign country with nothing, and through force of will and intelligence and ruthlessness and charm built himself into something that the world, try as it might, has never quite been able to look away from. Segment 1. The triangle that history never resolved. There is a version of this story that reduces it to gossip. The tycoon, the opera singer, the American queen, all entangled in ways that fed a public appetite for glamour and excess. That version has its appeal. But the actual people involved were stranger and more interesting than the gossip version allows. Maria Callas spent the last years of her life in near isolation in Paris. She gave occasional interviews. She taught master classes. She was photographed looking thin and withdrawn in the apartment that Onassis had paid for, in a city that had been the backdrop of the relationship that had cost her more than she could fully articulate. She never performed on stage again after 1965. She gave a series of concert tours in 1973 and 1974 with tenor Giuseppe Di Stefano. But the voice that had once stunned opera houses across the world was no longer what it had been. She retreated entirely after that. She died at 53, alone, with a red cashmere blanket nearby, a blanket she had given Onassis, which he had reportedly kept with him until the end of his own life, and which had somehow come back to her apartment in Paris. Tina Livanos, who had been 17 years old when she married Onassis, who had watched her husband openly conduct an affair until she had no choice but to leave him, who had then married his greatest rival, who had buried her son, and then, within 18 months, had died herself at 45. Left behind a story so tangled in grief and irony that it resists any clean summary. She had lived at the absolute center of the most powerful Greek-American social world of the 20th century, and she had paid for that position in ways that were devastating. Christina Onassis carried everything forward alone. She married 4 times, ran the empire her father built, and died at 37 in Argentina of cardiac arrest. Her daughter, Athena, born in 1985, is the sole surviving heir to whatever remains of the Onassis legacy. Aristotle himself, the boy from Smyrna who lost everything at 16 and rebuilt it on his own terms, remains one of those figures who resists the simplifications that history tends to impose on people. He was not a good man, precisely. He was unfaithful to every woman he was with, ruthless in his business dealings, capable of real cruelty alongside real warmth, and so driven by the need to be recognized and admired that it sometimes overwhelmed every other consideration. He was also, by the testimony of many people who knew him, genuinely funny, genuinely kind when he chose to be, and capable of a depth of grief when Alexander died that surprised people who had thought they knew exactly what he was made of. The marriages were scandalous because the world needed them to be. The reality was more complicated. A man who could not give the woman who loved him most what she actually needed, who married the most famous woman in the world, partly for reasons that were not very romantic, and who spent the last years of his life held together by surgical tape and the memory of a son he was never going to see again. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. Joan Collins. The name alone conjures a specific image: shoulder pads, sharp cheekbones, and an absolute command of every room she entered as Alexis Colby on Dynasty. At her peak, she was one of the most watched women on the planet, a symbol of glamour so total it seemed almost willed into existence by sheer force of personality. But behind that image were 3 marriages that most people have never looked at closely. 3 relationships that ranged from traumatic to heartbreaking to quietly devastating, in ways that Dynasty's scriptwriters could never have imagined, and that Joan herself has only spoken about fully in the last decade of her life. This is not a story about a glamorous woman making glamorous mistakes. It's something considerably more complicated than that. To understand it, we need to start at the beginning, with a 17-year-old girl newly signed to a film studio who had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. Segment 5. Who she was before. Joan Henrietta Collins was born on May 23, 1933, in Paddington, London, to a father who was a successful talent agent. His clients eventually included Tom Jones and the Beatles, and a mother who had been a nightclub dancer. She grew up in a household that was theatrical by nature, surrounded by the vocabulary of show business before she had any real understanding of what that world actually demanded of the people inside it. Her father, Joe Collins, was a self-made man who moved through the entertainment world with an easy confidence that his eldest daughter would eventually inherit. Her younger sister Jackie would go on to become one of the best-selling novelists in the world, known for glamorous, sharp-edged stories about power and desire. stories that drew very explicitly on the world both sisters had grown up observing from close range. Looking back, it's easy to see how both were shaped by the same household, one who filtered the drama through fiction and one who lived it. Joan was beautiful from childhood in the particular way that brought attention she hadn't asked for. Her mother reportedly hung a sign on her pram, warning strangers not to kiss her when she was a baby. That detail has a funny quality to it. But there's something else in it too. An early signal that her appearance was going to be something other people felt entitled to respond to, whether she invited it or not. That dynamic would follow her throughout her life, and most intensely into her early adult years. During the Second World War, the Collins family sheltered in the London Underground, alongside thousands of other Londoners, while German bombs fell on the city. Joan was a child through the Blitz, and that experience, the shelters, the sirens, the abrupt closures of normal life, gave her generation a particular relationship to disruption and survival that people who grew up in peace find difficult to fully appreciate. Things ended. People disappeared. You kept going. The matter-of-factness that Joan Collins has always brought to even the most difficult parts of her own history has its roots, probably somewhere in those years. By her mid-teens, she was performing in amateur productions, and the passion for it was serious enough that she eventually won a place at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. She trained, she worked, and by the time she was 17, she had signed to the Rank organisation, one of Britain's most significant film production and distribution companies of the era. She was making small appearances in films, building the early architecture of a professional career, and beginning to understand that her looks gave her a particular kind of power in an industry that was paying close attention. She was also, by her own later account, deeply innocent about men and about sex, in a way that was entirely typical for a well-brought-up girl of her generation and entirely dangerous for someone in her position. She had not had a boyfriend in any real sense. She knew almost nothing about what the world of older men in the film industry was actually like beneath its polished surface. She has said in interviews that she was, at 17, the equivalent mentally of a 12-year-old in terms of knowledge about sex and relationships, that the world she came from simply did not prepare young women for what they might encounter. She was at the Rank organisation, which meant she was surrounded by ambitious, experienced professionals in an industry where young women were frequently treated as assets rather than as people. She was 17, which is to say she was both old enough to be treated as an adult in professional settings and young enough to be completely unprepared for what that treatment could mean. She had, in those early months at Rank, appeared in small parts and was building the foundations of what would become a long career. She was earning the right to be taken seriously. She had no reason to think that being taken seriously and being protected were two different things. She was about to find out that they very much were. What came first was a man named Maxwell Reed. Segment 4. Maxwell Reed. Marriage as Obligation. Maxwell Reed was, in 1950, the kind of man who made 17-year-old girls feel very lucky to be noticed. He was 31, which is to say 14 years Joan's senior. Not an enormous gap when both people are adults, but a very significant one when one of them is a teenager and the other is a well-known actor with a practiced ease around women. He was Northern Irish, born in Larne in 1919, dark-haired, with the carefully constructed magnetism of a man who had worked out early that his looks were useful and had used them accordingly. He had served in the RAF during the war and in the Merchant Navy, and then reinvented himself as an actor through the Company of Youth programme at Rank. He was a matinee idol in the British cinema of the late 1940s, the kind of face that appeared on magazine covers and drew admiring letters from female fans. He had been promoted to leading man status quite young, made a number of films for Rank, including Daybreak, Night Beat, and There Is Another Sun. and built a reputation as a screen presence with a brooding, dangerous quality that translated well to certain kinds of roles. He had also, though Joan had no way of knowing this, been involved with a number of women in ways that his colleagues were aware of and that had not reflected well on him. When Reed asked Joan out, she went. She was a young actress newly signed to Rank. He was a famous star from the same studio. It seemed, by the social logic of the time, like an obvious and flattering connection. In the world that young actresses occupied in early 1950s Britain, being noticed by a man of Reed's standing was the kind of thing that happened to people on their way up. On their first date, he took her to his apartment. He gave her a drink, rum and coke, and what happened next was something she would not speak about publicly for decades. The drink had been tampered with. She lost consciousness and woke up to find that he had assaulted her. She was 17 years old and, by her own account, had never been with a man before. In the 2022 BBC documentary This Is Joan Collins, she described what had been done to her in terms that were both careful and clear. In the language of her mother's generation, she explained, it would have been called being taken advantage of. In the language of today, it was what it was. She was a teenager. She was a virgin. And what was done to her was done without her knowledge or consent. What happened in the weeks after is almost more difficult to understand than the assault itself, until you place it in the exact social and moral context of early 1950s Britain. Joan Collins continued to see Maxwell Reed, not because she wanted to, not because she felt anything for him, but because, as she has explained many times since, she felt that what had happened, however it had happened, had changed something about her. She had grown up in a world where a girl who was no longer a virgin had, by the conventions of the time, an obligation to the man who had changed that status. The guilt she carried was not about anything she had done, but guilt, in that era and in that cultural framework, did not require fault. It required only an outcome. She has spoken about this particular logic with a directness that is both matter-of-fact and quietly devastating. She hated him, she has said. She hated him, and she felt bound to him. And those two things existed at the same time without cancelling each other out. She has also made clear that she was not in a position, at 17, to know what resources she might have had, or to believe that anyone would have understood, or to trust that the story she would have had to tell could be told without destroying her entirely. They married in May 1952 at Caxton Hall Register Office in London. She was 18. He was 33. The wedding photographs show her in a long-sleeved gown, composed and beautiful, giving nothing away. The marriage was, by every account, as unhappy as the circumstances of its beginning predicted it would be. Reed was controlling and difficult at home. His film career was beginning to decline in Britain, and he moved them to Hollywood, where it continued to decline in a different city. The money that had seemed comfortable began to feel less certain. The life in California that was meant to be a fresh start was smaller and more constrained than either of them had imagined, and the constraints fell predominantly on Joan. There was also something worse. At some point during the marriage, Reed suggested, and then pressed, that Joan should sleep with a wealthy older man for money. She has described the intended partner as an Arab sheikh, and the proposed sum as a significant one. This was not framed as a suggestion, but as something he expected her to comply with. She refused. She went home to her mother. The marriage ended formally in divorce in 1956, after 4 years. Joan was 22. Reed subsequently filed for alimony on the grounds that he had earned very little in the previous 12 months, a claim that drew attention to the disparity between what the two of them had become professionally, and then eventually dropped it. Maxwell Reed died of cancer in October 1974 at the age of 55, having had almost no contact with Joan in the preceding 18 years. She has described him as the worst of her 5 husbands, without particular hesitation. Not with bitterness, exactly. More with the tone of someone stating an obvious fact. She left the marriage with her freedom, her career, and the beginning of a slow understanding of how the world actually worked for women in her position. She was 22, newly famous in her own right, and would spend the next several years building herself back into someone who did not feel defined by what had happened to her at 17. That process took time. It also eventually worked, because she kept showing up and kept building, which was the thing she would do over and over again for the rest of her life. The next man she fell in love with, the one she actually chose, wanted, and admired, would turn out to be a different kind of difficulty entirely. Segment 3. Anthony Newley, Marriage to a Genius. Between her divorce from Maxwell Reed in 1956 and her marriage to Anthony Newley in 1963, Joan Collins lived the kind of life that was interesting enough to fill several books, and she eventually wrote several. She moved freely between London and Hollywood, dated widely, was briefly engaged to Warren Beatty before that ended over his infidelity, and established herself as a working actress with genuine range and a growing public profile. She had roles in films that pushed against the sweet ingenue typecasting she had initially been given. Films that suggested she could carry darkness and complexity on screen in ways that would eventually make Dynasty feel like the role she had always been building toward. She was not naive when she met Anthony Newley. She was a 30-year-old woman who had been through one extremely difficult marriage, survived it, rebuilt her life, and arrived at the beginning of the 1960s with a clear-eyed understanding of how men could disappoint you. None of that prepared her for Anthony Newley. He was born in Hackney, East London, on September 24, 1931, the illegitimate son of a single mother who raised him largely alone. His father was absent from his life. He had left school at 14 and, through a combination of remarkable natural talent and relentless drive, had become by his early 30s one of the most celebrated entertainers in Britain and one of the most talked-about figures in American show business. He was an actor, a singer, a songwriter, a stage performer, a comedian, and a wit of the first order. He had scored a dozen UK chart hits, including 2 number ones. He had written, with his creative partner Leslie Bricusse, the music for some of the most memorable songs of the era, including What Kind of Fool Am I?, which won the Grammy Award for Song of the Year in 1963, sung by Sammy Davis Jr., and Feeling Good, which would become an enduring classic associated most powerfully with Nina Simone. His Broadway show Stop the World, I Want to Get Off, which he had co-written, directed, and starred in, had made him an international star. The songwriter, the showman, the self-invented working-class kid who had willed himself into a household name. It was an extraordinary story. He was also, by virtually every account from people who knew him, charming in a way that was almost impossible to resist. Charismatic, funny, deeply emotional, capable of great warmth, and very aware of all of these qualities in himself. He was the kind of man who made a room arrange itself around him. He also had a hunger for attention and excitement that extended, as it became clear over time, well beyond what a marriage could contain. Joan was captivated. She has described him as a genius, and she appears to have meant it without qualification. They married on May 27, 1963, and settled into a life in Los Angeles in a house on Summit Drive in Beverly Hills. They had 2 children, a daughter, Tara Sinara Newley, born October 12, 1963, and a son, Alexander Anthony Newley, known as Sasha, born September 8th, 1965. By most accounts, the first years of the marriage were genuinely good. Newley was at the height of his powers professionally, and the household on Summit Drive was one of the social centers of the entertainment world. Parties that brought together the most interesting and celebrated people of the decade. Music around the piano, conversation that crackled with wit and ideas. Joan has described those early years in terms that make clear she was genuinely happy in them, and that the happiness was not constructed or performed. But Anthony Newley had a quality that became clearer over time, a restless, consuming appetite for excitement and novelty that extended to women, specifically to young women, a preference he did not particularly try to conceal. Joan would describe him later as a serial womanizer, and the evidence she was given was impossible to miss. She has spoken about a birthday party they threw for him at their home, where Barbra Streisand was among the guests, and where Streisand sang to Newley in a way that, looking back, made the nature of their connection obvious to anyone paying attention. Joan did not know at the time that an affair between them was either already underway or about to begin. She found out later. Streisand herself would confirm the relationship decades afterward in her 2023 memoir, describing Newley as a man whose charisma drew women to him naturally and repeatedly. The Streisand affair was one among many. Newley was not discreet, and, more to the point, he did not seem to feel particularly apologetic about his behavior. He found younger women irresistible. That much was clear to Joan, and eventually to their children as well. He explained himself through his work more than through conversation or contrition, which meant that the clearest account of his infidelities came not from any private conversation, but from a public film. In 1969, Newley wrote, directed, and starred in a film called Can Hieronymus Merkin Ever Forget Mercy Humpe and Find True Happiness? An X-rated autobiographical musical that was, in the most direct possible way, a public account of his affairs. The character at the center of the film was an internationally known entertainer who recounts his various sexual adventures, including a relationship with a figure named Mercy Humpe. Joan appeared in the film as his on-screen wife. Their real children, Tara and Sasha, also appeared. Joan has described watching the private screening of the finished film and understanding, in a way that could no longer be argued away, exactly what her marriage had been and what her husband thought of the women in his life. The film was a critical and commercial catastrophe. The New York Times called it an act of professional suicide. It essentially destroyed Newley's mainstream film career in the United States. But for Joan, the damage was different in kind. It was personal, it was public, and it was impossible to recover from within the marriage. They separated in 1970. The divorce was finalized on August 13th, 1971. Joan was 37 years old. Tara was 7. Sasha was 5. Joan has described the period immediately after the marriage ended as one of the lonelier passages of her life. Not because she mourned the relationship, but because she was a single mother of 2 young children in a city that had watched her marriage fall apart in a very public way, in a film that had been reviewed in every major newspaper. And she had to decide what to do next with a career that had stalled and a personal life that had just sustained another serious blow. She has said she did not leave the marriage feeling hatred. What she felt was something more like sadness, the particular sadness of having loved someone genuinely and found that the love was real but not sufficient. Newley's talent was not in question. His creative gifts were extraordinary, and she never disputed that. But living inside the wreckage of his self-regard was not a life she was willing to continue, and the Merkin film had made the terms of the marriage clear in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. Their two children carry both of them in different ways. Tara became a writer and broadcaster. Sasha became a visual artist of genuine distinction. Both have spoken publicly about their father in terms that reflect the complexity of growing up with a man who was simultaneously remarkable and self-destructive. Anthony Newley married twice more after Joan and spent his later years largely in decline, professionally and personally. His attempt to return to Broadway in 1983 with a musical about Charlie Chaplin failed badly, losing $4 million. His personal life remained complicated. He died of renal cancer on April 14, 1999, at the age of 67, having moved back in with his elderly mother in Esher, Surrey, in his final months. The end of a life that had burned very brightly and then, over many years, burned down. The third marriage began almost immediately after the second ended. It began in the form of a man who pursued Joan so persistently and so warmly that resistance eventually became impossible. Segment 2. Ron Cass, Marriage in Crisis. Ron Cass was an American businessman who had been, in the late 1960s, one of the most important figures in the British music industry. Born in Philadelphia in 1935 as Ronald Stanley Cashinoff, his family had changed the name to Cass when they moved to California. He had studied accounting at UCLA, married young, and worked his way up through a series of recording companies: Liberty Records, MGM, Warner Brothers, before being brought to London to head a remarkable new venture. Apple Records, the label founded by the Beatles in 1968. Apple Records, in the period when Cass ran it, was one of the most creatively successful labels in the world. The roster included not just the Beatles themselves, but also James Taylor, Mary Hopkin, and Badfinger. The commercial division of Apple was a genuine success under Cass, in a way that the broader Apple Corps organization, which was losing extraordinary sums of money across its various other ventures, from a boutique on Baker Street to a film production company, was not. He was respected professionally and liked personally. He was also, as Joan would discover, a man capable of a sustained and genuine warmth toward the people he cared about. He had first met Joan before her divorce from Newley was finalized, and had made clear his feelings in a sustained and serious way. He wrote letters. He called. He proposed, multiple times, over the course of a year. Joan has described being bombarded with love, attention, and proposals, and being gradually and completely worn down by the sincerity of the campaign. After the experience of Newley's serial infidelities and the cold humiliation of the Merkin film, a man who simply and persistently wanted her, who was not distracted by his own legend, who was not rewriting the terms of the relationship every few months, was something she had not recently experienced. They married on March 11th, 1972. Joan was 6 months pregnant at the ceremony. Their daughter, Katiana Kennedy Cass, known as Katie, was born on June 20th, 1972. Joan has described the years immediately following as among the happiest of her life. She was 39 with a new baby, a loving husband, and what appeared to be a stable and affectionate marriage. The chaos and humiliation of the Newley years seemed genuinely behind her. She and Ron collaborated creatively as well as personally. He produced 2 of her films in the late 1970s, The Stud, 1978, and The Bitch, 1979. Both based on novels by her sister Jackie Collins, both of which were commercially successful and revived Joan's film career at a moment when it had seemed to be stalling. The first serious problem arrived from outside the marriage and from forces neither of them had control over. In 1969, before he and Joan had even married, Alan Klein had been brought in by John Lennon to take control of the Beatles' business affairs. Klein was a formidable operator with a reputation for clearing out existing management when he arrived anywhere. He viewed Cass as a potential obstacle and moved to remove him. The departure was sudden. For a man who had built something genuinely impressive and been pushed out through politics rather than failure, it was a professional wound that did not heal cleanly. After leaving Apple, Cass moved them to Los Angeles, where he attempted to establish himself as a film producer. There were successes. The Optimists in 1973, Naked Yoga in 1974, which received an Academy Award nomination for Best Documentary Short Subject. But the consistent momentum of the Apple years was difficult to rebuild. The entertainment industry in Los Angeles in the mid-1970s was a different kind of landscape from the British music industry he had mastered, and the footing was less certain. Business ventures that looked promising fell through. The financial landscape of the household shifted in ways that were hard to see until the cumulative change was very large. At some point during this period, Cass began using drugs. Joan has been specific about what this looked like from the inside. A husband who became uncommunicative, emotionally distant, increasingly unreliable with money. She went to marriage counselors, to specialists, to psychiatrists. She has described trying everything available to address what was happening, and nothing working. The man who had pursued her so warmly and so persistently had gradually become someone she could barely reach. Then, in 1980, something happened that overshadowed everything else. Katie, their daughter, was 8 years old and was struck by a car near their home in Los Angeles. The injuries were catastrophic. Serious brain trauma, a coma, an outcome that the doctors initially described as likely fatal. Joan has described being told that her daughter was going to die, and what that announcement felt like as a physical thing, as though the world had been rearranged around her. She remained at the hospital, at Katie's bedside, through those weeks with a focus that she has described as total. Everything else in her life became secondary, including the marriage, including her career, including everything. Katie survived. She recovered slowly and over a long period, eventually returning to something close to full health. Joan has said many times that the accident and its aftermath was the worst thing she had ever experienced, the threshold event of her entire life. It was also, painfully, a crisis she navigated largely without the emotional support of her husband, whose drug use had by that point become severe enough to render him absent in the ways that mattered most. By the early 1980s, the family's financial situation had become serious. They had moved through a series of progressively smaller houses as money contracted. It was in this period that Joan began to understand the full extent of what had happened to their finances. Ron had, at various points, forged her signature on documents to obtain money. The extent of the deception, when she finally saw it clearly, was difficult to absorb. Not just because of the money itself, but because of what it said about how far things had deteriorated while she had been trying, from her end, to hold the marriage together. Dynasty arrived in 1982. It changed everything professionally for Joan, gave her the role of Alexis Colby, made her one of the most recognized women on television, and provided her with the financial stability that her personal life had been systematically dismantling. She was nearly 50 years old, and a television show had saved her career and her independence simultaneously. She filed for divorce from Ron Cass in 1983, after 11 years of marriage. What happened afterward was complicated in its own right. Despite everything, the drugs, the financial destruction, the forgery, the years of watching a marriage collapse from the inside, Joan did not simply cut him off. When Cass was diagnosed with cancer, she helped pay for his medical treatment. When he was dying, she flew his sons from Switzerland to be with him. She was, by accounts from those around them, present at his bedside when he died in October 1986, at the age of 51. That particular detail says something about Joan Collins that the Alexis Colby character, all revenge and calculated cruelty, entirely misses. The woman who played television's greatest villain was capable in private of something quite different. And the story of those three marriages, taken together, is a story about a woman who kept finding that capacity even when the circumstances gave her every reason not to. Segment 1. What Three Marriages Left Behind. By the time Joan Collins sat down to film the BBC documentary in 2021, she was 88 years old and had been happily married for nearly 20 years to Percy Gibson, a theatre producer 32 years her junior. She was a dame of the British Empire, appointed by Queen Elizabeth II in 2015 for charitable services. She was, by every visible measure, a woman who had arrived at a version of herself that was settled and satisfied in ways that her earlier years had made no promises about. She spoke about Maxwell Reed with the particular flatness that comes from looking back at something too extreme to sentimentalize. She was clear about what had been done to her on that first date. She was clear about the circumstances that had led her to marry a man she hated. She was clear that the guilt she had felt, the suffocating, irrational guilt of a girl who had been violated and then felt obligated, was something she would not let young women around her carry without challenging it. She has said she hoped that hearing her story might help other women recognize that guilt is not the same thing as fault, and that the two can exist in the same moment without the guilt being deserved. The Maxwell Reed marriage was, in her own accounting, the worst of what happened to her. Not because of what came later, but because it was the first. Because it set the template of her vulnerability at a moment when she had no defenses built yet, no experience to draw on, no version of herself that had already survived something difficult. The Reed years were the foundation everything else was built on, and they were built on sand. She spoke about Anthony Newley with something more complicated, a kind of sorrowful appreciation that had survived the wreckage of the marriage. She still thought he was a genius. She still recognized the early years as genuinely good, and she allowed herself to say so without it sounding like an excuse for what came later. She has been consistent on this point, that a man can be genuinely talented and genuinely difficult and genuinely loved, all at the same time, and that none of those things cancels the others out. The loss of what they could have been together was something she acknowledged without pretending it didn't exist, and without letting the acknowledgement become self-pity. Their two children, Tara and Sasha, grew up with the complicated legacy of an extraordinary father who was also an absent one in the ways that mattered most. Tara became a writer and broadcaster. Sasha became a visual artist and portraitist of genuine distinction. Both carry their father's talent and their mother's resilience in a combination that speaks well for both of them. What Sasha has said publicly about his father, allegations that went considerably further than his mother was willing to go, Joan has firmly disputed, and the dispute between siblings on that question remains unresolved. What is beyond dispute is that the family came through it together, in their various complicated ways. The Cass years she spoke about with the heaviness that comes from genuinely loving someone and watching them dissolve. She had tried. She had stayed long past the point where staying was easy, and the reason she had stayed was Katie, keeping the family together for a child who had nearly died and who needed whatever stability could be offered. The forgeries and the financial destruction were things she described with the tone of a woman who had processed them fully and did not need to revisit them with anger, because anger had long since been replaced by something quieter and harder to name. Ron Cass died in October 1986, 3 years after their divorce. at the age of 51. Joan was with him. That particular detail, that she chose to be present at the end of the life of a man who had, among other things, forged her signature, spent her money, and failed her in a crisis, says something about who she actually is that no television role has ever quite captured. Across 3 marriages, she had been assaulted, and then felt bound to her assailant by guilt, loved a genius who could not keep faith with her, and watched a good man dismantle himself in front of her eyes. Each one had been its own kind of education. Each one had cost her something specific: her innocence in the first, her faith in genuine love in the second, her financial security and several years of peace in the third. What did not disappear was Joan Collins herself, the woman who had started as a teenager at a London film studio and ended up somewhere she could not have predicted and would not have chosen through the suffering, but arrived at nevertheless. She kept working through all of it. Through the Reed marriage, she kept building her career. Through the Newley marriage, she survived a decade of humiliation without it turning her bitter. Through the Cass years and the financial ruin, she walked onto the set of Dynasty at 49 years old and gave a performance that changed the direction of her entire professional life. She has described her 5th husband, Percy Gibson, in terms that are both romantic and simply true: that he is the most honourable man she has ever met, that she learned with him how to be in a relationship in the right way, getting to know each other fully before committing, which she acknowledged she had not done with any of the previous 4. They met in 2000, when he was producing a play she was starring in. They married on February 17th, 2002, at Claridge's Hotel in London, in a ceremony attended by friends, including Dame Shirley Bassey and Rupert Everett. 3 marriages before the age of 50. 3 completely different kinds of difficulty. And then, at 68, something that finally worked. The Alexis Colby who stalked the corridors of Dynasty was fiction, a spectacular, entertaining fiction, but fiction nonetheless. The woman who built something real out of the wreckage of 3 marriages and came out the other side as a dame of the British Empire with a happy marriage and a clear sense of herself. That version of Joan Collins is considerably more interesting. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.